Great, welcome to week 1, and we will now be looking at the knowledge area, business analysis, planning and monitoring. Keep in mind that with this knowledge area, I've broken it into 3 short video lessons that covers all the different tasks within this knowledge area. So make sure you look at all 3 of the videos to get coverage of all the tasks. Great, I'm going to share my screen with you now and we can get stuck into it. Okay, so let me just do that. Wonderful. Great, so business analysis, planning and monitoring. So this is the first knowledge area listed in chapter 3 of the BABOK guide. This chapter is all about the tasks that organize and coordinate the efforts of business analysts and stakeholders. So literally think about this as all the planning that needs to be done in terms of an approach to follow, who will the stakeholders be, where do we store all of our business analysis information or how do we manage it, as well as looking at some performance improvements. But let's walk through this systematically. So the first task here in this knowledge area is called Planned Business Analysis Approach. The second one, planned stakeholder engagement. The third, planned business analysis governance, planned business analysis information management. And the last task is identify business analysis performance improvements. Just a quick note, I trust you've looked at the BABOK structure overview video to help you understand how the BABOK information is organized. So you would now know that we're looking at a knowledge area, which is then broken down into the different tasks. And then each of these tasks will be defined in terms of certain aspects. And we will specifically cover the purpose of a task, as well as the key elements that you need to consider when you perform a particular task, when we do these particular videos. I also would like to remind you that you can read this chapter in the BABOK guide to get a really comprehensive understanding, or you can read the notes that I provide on your dashboard. Excellent. So let's get started. So we'll look at planned business analysis approach. So this task is to define an appropriate method to conduct business analysis activities. So if you think about this, there are certain elements that you need to consider before you can perform this particular task. So you need to think about the planning approach. You need to think about what formality and level of detail the business analysis deliverables need to be in. You need to consider what business analysis activities will we need to perform. What will be the timing of the business analysis work? What are the complexities and the risks that's associated with the business analysis activities for a particular initiative? And then what would be the acceptance procedures, which is quite an important consideration. So let's now take each of these elements and just delve a tiny bit deeper into them. So the first one, planning approach. These are basically, there are, as you would know, 2 main planning approaches. The one is the predictive planning approach. This is where you try and minimize upfront uncertainty and you make sure that the solution is first designed and analyzed before it gets implemented. So this is referred to as the waterfall approach or methodology. So the first phase needs to be finished before you can move on to the next phase and so forth. And then, of course, the adaptive approach, which is agile, basically an agile way of working. So with an adaptive approach, you have got rapid delivery of business value in short iterations in return for accepting that there are higher levels of uncertainty. So nothing gets over-analyzed or over-designed. It's broken down and it's accepted that there's things that you don't know before you start implementing. So just be mindful of these 2 approaches. For the exam, know what a predictive approach is, what is an adaptive approach, and understand their attributes. Also keep in mind that when you do your business analysis approach task or you do your planning, you can actually mix these two approaches. You wouldn't necessarily only use one particular approach. But again, it all depends on your environment and the type of work that you need to plan for and the type of organization you need to consider. What is their practices? All right, so if we then jump right into the next element, we're looking at formality and the level of detail of business analysis deliverables. So again, if you were planning within a predictive approach, then typically it would be more formal, the documentation and all of your processes. You would probably need to follow a template and adhere to certain internal processes to make sure that you can then provide the detail that they require. Whereas if it's an adaptive approach predominantly, your focus is more on the interaction and feedback that you received on the work that you're doing, and it's less about doing extensive formal documentation up front. So keep in mind that with an adaptive approach, you may still need to do detailed documentation, but work tends to be more on a just-in-time basis. And finally, documentation may be formalized after the solution is implemented for the purposes of knowledge transfer. That's quite an important point to remember when it comes to adaptive approaches. All right. So now let's look at this particular question around the formality, because, you know, as a trainer and a mentor, I often get asked the question, so how much is enough? How much information do I need to capture? How much detail do I need to do? And this is not always a black and white answer. So let's quickly consider some of the other considerations or reasons that helps determine that level of detail in terms of formal documentation. All right. So those further considerations that you need to be aware of is the complexity and risk. So you can imagine the more complex and the higher the risk of the initiative, the more formal documentation you may need to do. Again, regulatory industry requirements. This is another reason why you may be forced to do more formal documentation. Contracts and agreements often also guide you in terms of how much detail you need to provide to meet those agreements. And sometimes it helps also when you've got a geographically dispersed team of stakeholders, documentation becomes more important. So that will also have an impact on the level of detail that you need to provide. Sometimes resources are outsourced. Sometimes staff turnover might actually be high, or the team is very inexperienced in a particular subject area, and then you might need to do more documentation. Formal requirement for sign-off. So this may, sometimes in banks, for example, where there is very big governance happening around projects, you might have to adhere to certain levels of detail to be able to help the project move along to its next stage. Business analysis information might need to be maintained in the long term. Again, depending on the type of project you're working on, this might actually be quite important for you to have that level of detail and that level of formal documentation. So I think what's important with this one, sorry for jumping around, but what's important here is that you really spend a bit of time thinking about these aspects, because when you get asked in the exam about a particular scenario, these are the types of considerations you need to apply. So the next element that we need to look at is the business analysis activities. So when we plan the business analysis approach, we need to identify all the activities that needs to be done in order to deliver a particular deliverable. And you tend to then break down each of these activities into specific tasks. Or in a more adaptive style of working, you might divide work into iterations and define deliverables for each of those iterations, which then gets broken down into tasks. The other element that you need to think about is the timing of business analysis work. So whereabouts, depending on the methodology that's being followed and so forth, what are the timing considerations? When do we have to do the work we need to do? So let's look at what are the factors that can affect the timing of business analysis work. So specific phases or iterations, that often is one of the main drivers for our deadlines. How available are resources? Priority or urgency of a particular initiative or a subset of requirements. Any other concurrent initiatives that may be hindering us or expediting the work requirements. Other constraints such as contract terms or regulatory deadlines. So those are the items that you need to think about in terms of the timing aspect. Now, almost the second last element to consider here is around complexity and risk. So when it's a really complex initiative and it's really quite high risk, then of course you will have to plan for that. You would have to plan time, resources that's got the necessary skill sets, plus the documentation, the level of documentation. All of these things will suddenly become more important. And you need to think about that when you do your analysis approach for an initiative. Some specific risk factors that you need to consider is how experienced are the BAs on this initiative? How much do we know? How much domain knowledge do we have in the team? What is the stakeholders' experience? Generally speaking, what's the attitudes of the people we have to deal with? And amount of time allocated by a stakeholder to participate. So a lot of you would have been exposed to this, where you may be dependent on stakeholders that's got a lot of knowledge but not a lot of time. So all of these risk factors play a role when you do your business analysis approach. Complexity factors, of course, is the number of stakeholders, which always have a big impact. The size of the change, geographical limitations, if everybody's around the world, how will we be doing our requirements work? Technology, what technologies do we have available and what technologies are we working with? So all of these are really important things from an exam perspective to appreciate and to know that you need to think about these elements. You may not be required to list them off in a kind of parrot style. It's about interpretation and it's about understanding all of these aspects that needs to be considered when you do particular tasks. So if you look at it from that perspective, it will help you a lot. All right, so the last element for this task is acceptance. Here it's all about thinking upfront, how will our work be reviewed, who will be reviewing it, and also how do we get agreement that the work that we've delivered is in fact good and agreed by all our stakeholders. This is really important, and in practice, it's a good idea to define this upfront and circulate this with your team. Make sure everybody is on board and they understand what is expected of them. All right. So that's why it's a good idea. Then everybody knows exactly what's expected of them. Can you think of another good idea? All right. So we've now talked about the very first task, all the elements within the task, and the next section would be about the next task, which is planned stakeholder engagement. But before that, I'd like to put this over to you. So based on this task, raise some of the questions about this topic in the Facebook group. So let's start to have a bit of a discussion on that. What examples can you share where you may have experienced where certain elements of this task maybe were really well executed, or perhaps you've had experiences where these elements were not all considered, and what was the repercussions of that? And anything that you think other people should know about the exam in the context of this particular task. Let's help each other get through this one and get a good understanding of it. Great. Thank you very much. This was the first task and the first part of this Knowledge Areas 3 videos. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you.